Hi, I'm Alessia, and you're about to watch a message that was preached at Calvary Fellowship in Miramar, Florida. At Calvary, we exist to help you take your next step with God. If you'd like to learn more about Calvary, make sure to download our mobile app on the App Store or Google Play Store by searching up My Calvary.
How's everybody doing? Hey, we are so glad that you're here. By the way, this band, didn't they do a great job today? So good, so good. So good. So my mom has this picture in her house of my wife and I the first time we rode Splash Mountain. So now there's two pieces of information you need to know about this picture. One is that my wife loves roller coasters. And because there's some people that the feeling of impending doom, that thrills them in some way. And how many of you like roller coasters? Can I say? Wow. See, all these people need medication right here. And I can almost assure you that if you raised your hand, you're married to someone who did not raise their hand. That's just weird. God does something. But anyway, so if my wife loves roller coasters, then you'd know that I do not love roller coasters. I don't even like heights. You're like, are you afraid of heights? No, I'm not. I have an aversion to heights, which is totally different. All right? So it's different. So anyway, back to the picture. Now, here's the thing you got to understand, is that I don't like roller coasters. My wife does. And so when we were going to ride the ride, my wife says to me, she goes, the best thing is to be right in the front. That's the best. And I'm like, are you sure? I think the opposite is true. She's like, well, where do you want to sit? And I'm like, I don't know, the gift shop? I don't even need to be on this. I could just wait for you. And so anyway, but I'm trying to be a moderately okay husband, so I said okay. And so we go on the ride, and the picture, which I don't have for you, I'm just going to tell you about it. It's okay. It's okay. I'll show you another picture of me later. And I can email you all a picture of me if you guys want that. But anyway, the picture tells the whole story. Is that when you see the picture, my wife is like this. Laughing, hands up, just enjoying life on the front row, the water's splashing. And then I'm right next to her, and let me see if I can get this right. I'm like this. And I am holding on to that bar as if it's the only thing keeping me alive. Any bar holders? Anybody? All right, thank you. We're going to all start a small group together. And I'm going to hand everybody like a piece of pipe, and so we all feel comfortable. So now, here's the thing about holding on to the bar. Now, because I realize this, I still do it, but I realize it. There's nothing rational about holding on to the bar, because it's not like that's helping in any way. The fact that the bar's on your lap, that's a good thing. But, there's this thing that happens just as people where we just have this instinctual desire to control. And so whenever we feel out of control, we just try to control something. And so we'll find ourselves in circumstances where everything seems out of control. And maybe you've noticed this, that you do this, or because I do this. Everybody does this at some point. When everything seems out of control, we try to fixate on one thing, however insignificant, that we try to control. And there's this kind of space that happens where there's reality, and then there's our ability to control things. And however far that gap is between reality and our ability to control things, what we fill with the in-between is worry, anxiety, questioning God's love for us, and all of that. And once again, there are some moments where things seem seemingly under control, and there's other moments when things seem very, very far apart. And yet it's in that space where spiritual maturity is born. Because even though and sometimes we don't, but we have to recognize our inability to control, and yet God's complete control of all situations. And it's a hard lesson to learn, and the sad reality is that you don't learn it once. It's a lesson that we have to keep continually learning. But if we want to be mature spiritually, we have to learn it, and we have to live it. So we're in the final part of a series that we've been calling 5. And the reason that we call it 5 is because whenever you talk to someone who's mature, as I look back in, my own life and whatever level of maturity I have or don't have, but I can say this, that there are really about 5 situations, right? There's 5 things that cause growth and kind of catapult our faith. Because, and here's the challenge for us, is that when you're a kid, right, or when you had kids, you notice this, is that kids growing, it's almost automatic, right? As long as you ate, slept, ran around during recess, the growth was seemingly automatic. And then you became a Christian and the markers weren't quite so clear. And in the beginning, we feel like we're growing because we're hearing all this information for the very first time. And wow, I didn't know that. That's totally new. And then what happens is that you learn the stories, you memorize some verses, you learn the lyrics to the songs, and now you're like, well, man, is this all that there is? The good news is that's not all that there is. The bad news is that all the growth is seemingly in the areas that we tend to avoid. And so what I've found is, and once again, you can talk to anybody that you would look up to and consider to be mature, there's like these 5 catalysts, these 5 ingredients, that the more that we lean into them, the growth seems almost endless. Now, if you've been with us throughout the series, you know I've talked about this every week. And if you haven't, I'll give you a quick refresher. So we're all like, so this is like, previously on 5, this is kind of going to get you up to speed. So the first one is this, what we call practical teaching. This is the moment when you say, I started attending this church, I started attending this Bible study, and the Bible seemed to come alive for me. And there was this immediate growth that happened in your life because it took you from where you were. Practical teaching took you from where you were to ultimately where God wanted you to be. The second is providential relationships. This is where you meet someone who's on the journey with you, and they just kind of seemingly showed up at the right moment, at the right time, and they just helped you make some good choices that once again propelled your faith. The third is what we call private disciplines, and this is where you learn to pray and study the Bible privately, and so a lot of public obedience, a lot of public things that you did in your walk with God stemmed from what you learned to do privately. The fourth is what we call private ministry, or personal ministry. This is where, and whenever you hear somebody's story, it's like, well, man, when did you really start growing? Well, they asked me to lead that Bible study. They asked me to teach that class. They asked me to serve in that ministry, and that just seemed to really launch and propel my faith. And then the fifth is what we call pivotal circumstances. And these are times of difficulty when you've had to trust God because you've had no other options. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about today. And that is, what do we do in times of trial and times of difficulty? And how do we respond to the challenges that come into our lives that we don't think that we deserve? Because there are problems that come into our lives that are fully of our own doing. And what I've noticed is that, and maybe you recognize this, that whenever something comes in your life and you realize like it's on you, like you don't question God, you're like, you make like a bad financial decision and then something happens, you're like, oh, snap, that one's on me, and that, or, like you eat too much at Thanksgiving, you're like, God, why? And like nobody's questioning that. You just realize that, hey, this one's on me. But it's usually when we start questioning, God, are you really there? Do you really love me? Have you forgotten me? It's when something happens and we don't think we did anything wrong. Something happens and we feel like, hey, but I was doing the right thing. And this thing came into my life. And these are the things that kind of challenge our faith and maybe for some of us, if we're being honest, caused us to question faith. Or maybe if we're being real honest, is maybe why some of us at one point walked away. And now we're just kind of making our way back. And here's the thing, the strange thing is that the people that we look at and that we admire, that say, man, I would love to have a faith like he does, like she does, like they do. That faith did not happen. That kind of rock solid, unshakable faith didn't happen because their life was easy. It happened because they experienced probably more than one, but a trial, a difficulty, a challenge, and they had an experience with God that changed them forever. Because what they realized is that God isn't sending this into my life to break me. Instead, he's sending this into my life to build me. In his book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis, who if you've been around for a while, I quote Lewis all the time, but C.S. Lewis says in this little book called The Problem of Pain, he says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain, that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Because there is a connection between testing and a faith that's unshakable. James, who is the half-brother of Jesus, is a guy who wasn't even a Jesus follower. If you read the Gospels, he was trolling Jesus during his ministry, giving Jesus a hard time until after the resurrection, and that's when he became a Jesus follower. But here's what he had to say in his letter in the New Testament. He says this: "Consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colors. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature and well-developed, not deficient in any way." Now here's what that means. That means that God is up to something in your life when a pivotal circumstance arrives. Sometimes there's something that disrupts your life and you're like, man, what is happening here? God is up to a deep work that he wants to do. And the best way to see this is to look at a scene from the life of Jesus. Now, let me just say this, that I know if you've been around for a while, and some of you, you've read through the Bible, like you probably know this story, but here's what I'm going to ask you to do, and I know this is difficult, but I'm going to ask you to kind of slow down and experience the story with the character. So kind of, if you can, forget that you know the end of the story, because this isn't God just doing a work in someone's life when a pivotal circumstance comes their way. This is God creating the actual circumstance, which I think is so powerful. So we're going to be in John chapter 11. This is a very famous story of when we learn about a friend of Jesus who has gotten ill. And so if you have your Bible, John 11, if you have the notes, you can look on the screen. If you have your Calvary app, the only place where, unless you close your eyes, that's the only place you're not going to see the text. But anyway, so John chapter 11, verse 1, here's what we read. He says, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore, the sister sent to him, saying, 'Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick.' When Jesus heard that, he said, 'This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" Verse 5, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." So if you pause there and give me your attention, there's three things that we're going to talk about when it comes to growing pains. But the first is this, is that difficulties are not the absence of God's love. You have to understand that there's a category almost that's being created here. It's the category of not just that difficulties can come into your life, but that there's this moment that difficulties can actually be created for the purpose of God using it to glorify himself and do a good work in you through it. Now, the problem is that if you're anything like me, you would prefer to glorify God through something good that comes into your life, right? Like, I want to write a song that wins a Grammy. And then I want to go to the Grammy, receive my award, and just be like, hey, I want to thank Jesus for giving me this song to write. This one's for him. And then everybody claps and walks off, By the way, isn't it weird? You ever notice that people, isn't it weird though? You watch the Grammys and there's like these songs that you're like, I don't know if they were really thinking about God when they wrote them. And then people are thanking God. Isn't it, I'm telling you, you watch one of these award shows and hey, I just want to thank God for inspiring me to write this song, Booty Call. And you're like, really? Were they thinking about God? I don't know. I don't know if that's too far, but I'm sure someone will tell me after. But it is weird. And then there's this other thought that I have, which is is there someone at home that's thinking who is this God that inspires men to write Booty Call? I must learn more of him. I don't know. And so, but anyway, thanking God when things go great works a little. But the thing that really works is when we honor God when things aren't going our way. You see, they tell Jesus that the one that he loves is sick. And just so we get it, it says it again in verse 5. It says, and then Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Twice he's telling us why. And it's not in a, Jesus loves everybody kind of way. These were his friends. He was tight with this family. And here's the point. Trials in your life does not mean that God is absent. It means that God is at work through the trial you're experiencing, because there is good fruit that comes from a bad situation. Every so often, I'll have an engaged couple come to me, and they're so excited, and I'm excited for them, and they'll say, what do we need to do to have a good marriage? And I'll say everything that you would kind of expect me to say. You got to honor God and put him first, put your spouse before yourself, and invest in your relationship. And then they'll say something like, oh, that's what it takes to have a great marriage. Like, oh, no, whoa. I said what it takes to have a good marriage. If you want to have a great marriage, you're going to have to go through some pain. And they're like, what? You mean it's not just like brunch? And like, no, it's not just brunch. And why? Because when you look at great marriages aren't just people who have done that. Everything that I said, which is all good and important. Great marriages are couples that have gone through hardship. They've gone through pain, and they have lived to tell the tale. Those are the greatest marriages that you're ever going to meet. And it's not that they invited the difficulty into their marriage. It's that trials are part of life, and they didn't give up. And you know what happened? Their marriage became unbreakable. You see, but in the season of difficulty, is that we've got to remember that these things come into our lives for a reason. And the reason is not, well, God just doesn't love us, he's forgotten us. No, it's that God does love us, and he wants to do a deep work in us. But sometimes what we want is we want the growth without the difficulty. So let me explain it this way. So I've been playing guitar. I got a bass guitar on my 15th birthday. And there's part of playing guitar that hurts. So you start playing, and you start developing, you get blisters on your fingers from playing. Because once again, it's an unnatural thing to hold down pieces of, like wire and nickel and, whatever. And so eventually you get blisters. That the blisters pop, and that hurts. And then you keep playing, but you're playing on like raw skin. And then you try to kind of like turn your finger, but that doesn't work. And so you're playing on, and then eventually the calluses develop. And when you develop the calluses, now it doesn't hurt anymore. But the good news is that science and American commerce have developed a way to avoid the calluses altogether, so that you can just get to playing without any pain. And so here, I'll show you the picture of what's available. These are fingertip protectors available on eBay for only 99 cents. And it's a deal just for you today. You act now. They're 99 cents plus shipping. And now, here's what you can get. You can get all these fingertip protectors, and they will keep you from feeling any pain when you start playing. But can we just imagine? So we're still at the Grammys, right? I just got my award for best song. And then someone says, oh, this other artist is up. And they're like, oh, I'm up. And then they start putting on their fingertip like, who is going to listen to an artist that wears fingertip protect? Like, nobody's going to take them seriously, because here's what we realize, but here's what we ask for without even realizing it. We want like fingertip protectors for life. I want the result, but I don't want any of the pain of it. And it just doesn't work. And by the way, a musician that won't endure the pain in his fingers will never endure the pain of living and write a song that resonates with everyone. There's just no way. And the same thing is true in your life, that God loves you so much that he's willing to allow you to face some challenges, because it's going to give you a voice, because it's going to give you a depth of understanding who God really is. And that's what this family is about to learn. So back to the text. We go to verse 6. Here's what it says. So when he heard the news that Lazarus, was sick, I underlined this in my Bible. It says this: he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. Skipping down to verse 14, Jesus says to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. And then Thomas, who's called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, well, let's go also, that we may die with him. And by the way, this guy has like a bad attitude. Like, talk about the Eeyore of the group, like he's always got something to say negative. Anyway, verse 17, it says, so when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus, had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now, Martha As soon as she heard Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to her, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, yet shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. If you pause there and give me your attention, here's a second thing I want you to know, and that is that trials are the incubator that build faith. Now, this is why Jesus is saying to his disciples, I'm glad I wasn't there because now you're going to believe. And then he tells to Martha, he says, anything is possible, right? Well, your brother's will rise again. Oh, yeah. And she gives some kind of theological answer. And he's like, no, don't you get it? I'm the resurrection. Do you believe this? And he focuses her attention on the person of Jesus. Now, here's why this is so important. Because it won't be very long before they see Jesus die and experience the 3 longest days of their lives. You see, they don't realize it, but Jesus is preparing them for something greater that's about to happen. And they will go through the hopelessness of the weekend between the crucifixion of Friday and then the joy of Easter morning on Sunday. And Jesus is telling his disciples, this is so that you will believe. And he's telling Martha, this is so you will believe. And he asks her, do you believe this? Because it is impossible to build a faith without testing. Because a faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. And there are moments when things happen and we will not understand why. And there are moments that we're going to have to learn to trust an unknown future to a known God. And sometimes it's only after the fact that we're going to understand some of why this came into our lives. So about 12 years ago or so, I had to buy a grill. And so I was looking for one that was already pre-assembled. And the reason is, at the time, I'm a little handier than I used to be, but at the time, I'm like, I just want to buy one pre-assembled, and I just bring it to my house, and that's the end of it. So they didn't have one at the Home Depot by my house, so I drove up to Sheridan, here to Lowe's, to get it. And so, because they had them, and if you've been to Lowe's, you know that they have them all kind of lined out in the patio there. So I just picked one, went inside, paid for it, and I just wheeled it out to my car. And but when I don't do things like measure, and I don't do things like that. I just kind of like make it happen. And so anyway, so I bring it to the car and realize that, and I used to drive this little Honda CRV, and I dropped the seats and it didn't fit. And I'm like, okay, but I thought if I can just take the top off, I can kind of like jam it in there and then put the top on my front seat, and then it'll work. But so I'm kind of trying to figure all this out, and I'm like, I need a screwdriver to take off the top and all that. As I'm in the parking lot, this guy walks over to me and says, hey, do you need some help? I'm like, well, yes, I do. And so he says, well, what are you trying to do? And I'm explaining to him, I'm trying to take this grill and put it in my car. And now, just to kind of give you an idea of this guy. And so the guy's wearing a T-shirt, and he's wearing a pair of shorts. But the shorts, my guess is these are the same shorts that he wore, like, let's just say in middle school. And now he's 40. Because you know how you grow, like there's an elongation that happens in your life, and the shorts that maybe had been normal size when you're in middle school now start seeing very short. And to be honest with you, short enough to where I'm feeling uncomfortable. And there's like a tightness that's making me feel a little weird. And so anyway, so this guy shows up, he's got a T-shirt and very short, tight shorts. And he's asking me if I need help. And I'm like, yeah, I just got to get a screwdriver to take off this lid. Now, let me just say something here. I don't know how, and I don't know where. But this guy reaches back. And he pulls out a somewhat sizable screwdriver. And I'm thinking, I don't even want to know. where this situation has been hiding all this time. Which, by the way, leads me to believe that perhaps he came into the store without the screwdriver and then left with it. But at this point, I don't care because I need a screwdriver and he's made his available. And so anyway, so I, say a quick prayer because I don't know where that thing's been. And I now unscrew the top of this thing off. And while we're talking, we have this whole conversation about family and life. And we had just had a baby at the time. And so we're having this whole talk. And he's telling me that, he hadn't seen his kids. And so, anyway, we're having this whole conversation. And so at the end of it, I just say, hey, can I pray for you? And so they're in the middle of the Lowe's parking lot with a stolen screwdriver, perhaps, and shorts that are so tight he may not even be breathing deep breaths. I pray for the guy, and then I drive off. I don't think anything of it. So I get home and I screw the thing back in because I have normal screwdrivers at my house. And so then we're getting, because you buy a grill, like, hey, we're gonna grill. So I get some steaks and I'm gonna put them on the grill, and then I go outside, and this is in our old house, and I open the top and I see this giant rat. Now I know what you're thinking. What you're thinking is like, oh, like a giant rat? No. I want to stretch your imagination to reality. This thing was like a small possum. And it was mean, and I don't know, and I just was like, what? And I just closed it. I didn't know what to do. I just closed the top of the grill, and I said, God, you got to be kidding me. There is no way. I open it up. I didn't see the rat, and then I'm looking around like, where did this thing go? And then I thought maybe it's some kind of demon. I don't know. And so demon rat. I mean, maybe there's something. And so. So anyway, so now I have another decision to make, and that is, do I tell my wife everything that I've seen? Because I could just live my life and not say anything. So, and I think, like, I don't even know. I haven't even made the decision. So I walk in the house, and she's like, so how is it? I'm like, oh, it's fine. How are you doing today in your life? This fine evening yourself. I don't know. And she's like, why are you acting weird? I'm like, I'm not acting weird. You're acting weird this fine evening in Miramar yourself. And I don't know. I'm just trying to say something and just, act casual. And apparently I'm making it worse. And I don't know how, but she's like, no. And I'm like, no what? And she's like, don't even tell me. Tell you what? And she's like, just tell me. I thought you didn't want to know. Just tell me. And so I said, I opened the thing and there was a giant rat. And she's like, no! And she starts screaming. I don't know if you ever see Kermit the Frog when he starts doing one of these kind of screams? And it was like that. At least that's how I remember it. And anyway, so I tell him, it's the Lowe's rat. And anyway, and so now we had another decision to make. Anyway, I used that grill for like 10 years. And I just used a little scraper, and whatever didn't scrape off just was added flavor. And so don't judge, you would have done it too. So that night, I'm laying in bed and I'm praying and I'm like, Lord, I get it. There wasn't a grill at Home Depot because you wanted me to go to Lowe's, and you wanted me to pray with that guy, to tell that guy that you love him, to reconnect with his family, and that you're with him, and that totally makes sense. And I understand that. And then how that whole thing kind of worked together, and it just so happened to be at the right moment. And that's why I couldn't fit the grill in the car, because he had stolen a screwdriver, and that was just like the moment, right? And then okay, so that makes sense. And like then you have that moment, like you understand. And I'm like, but Lord, what's up with that rat? Like, that's just a nasty business, right? And now here's the reality, right? Is that there are these moments, right, that come into our lives. And there are some times that we're just not going to understand fully the why. And this is where faith is formed. And we don't actually learn to trust God until we actually have to trust God. But it's in those difficult seasons that God is forging our faith. Peter, who was there that day, that Jesus said, you're going to believe when you see this. He's listening to all this, and here's what he says. He writes a letter to a group of Christians. Here's what he says. So be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show you that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. See, what do you do when the unimaginable happens? See, there are things that happen in our lives, and I'm not just talking about like weird difficulties or whatever, but I'm talking about like tragic moments. And what'll happen is that either whether we say it out loud or whether we whisper it to ourselves privately, we will say, how could a loving God allow this to happen? That's the question that Martha's asking. When she says, Lord, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. Which invites the question, so why weren't you here? We told you days ago that this was going down, and you waited on purpose for this to happen. You see, it's the same question that if you read a few verses later that her sister Mary asks, literally the same words. Why? Because obviously they were having that conversation. And so now the question is, and this is the challenge, is that we start feeling like we've been treated unfairly. But here's the challenge, is that life isn't fair. Because we live in a world that is broken. And our hope is not in the world becoming fair and dealing us a better hand. Our hope is in the person of Jesus and him coming back, creating a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness and justice dwell. And that's why Jesus gives Martha, and he starts leading her in this conversation to give her a perspective of eternity that far exceeds life and all of its troubles. You see, there's the thing that we forget sometimes, because the world is beautiful that we live in, and there's so much joy that we can experience, and then sometimes these tragic moments happen, and we forget. It's like they take us by surprise because we forget that this world is going to fail us, and we forget that this world is so deeply broken. And sometimes God gets blamed for the tragedies and that happen, and every, gets blamed for every illness or every storm or every kind of attack or whatever that happens. And sometimes if we can think about it, and I know these are such emotional things, but if we could think about it reasonably for a moment, it's not reasonable to blame God. And here's why. Because when we say, but yeah, couldn't God have stopped that storm? But couldn't God have changed that shooter's mind? Couldn't God just heal every disease? Let's examine that for a moment, if we can. You see, if God did stop every bullet and keep every evil thing from happening, there's a word for that. And that word is heaven. And desiring that is a good thing, and longing for that is a great thing, and seeking for that, that's the right thing. But listen, we all want God to stop every bullet and keep every disaster from happening, but this isn't heaven, and this world reminds us almost on a daily basis that this isn't it. Because when God created mankind, he created us with a will, the ability to make choices to either follow him or reject him. And for God to deny a person the right to make a choice, even if it's a terrible one, is denying that person the ability to be human. So when we're asking God to intervene, understand what we're asking for. We're asking God to rob us of our ability to love, because for love to be real, there has to be the ability to not love. And in doing so, we're asking God to rob us of our humanity, because when we were created with the ability to choose. You see, if God stopped every evil thing from happening, we wouldn't even have the ability to ask the question, because the freedom of choice has been taken away. And so we have this ability to choose because we were created to love God, to love other people, and that's why these moments hurt us so deeply. Because they are an offense to us of what it means to be human, because we intrinsically understand that we were created to love, and these moments violate our humanity. But see, the Christian is able to love God supremely and trust that there is a meaning to all of this madness and there will ultimately be justice. And this is why times of difficulty produce such a great amount of faith in your life. And here's how the story continues and ends. Look at verse 33. It says, "Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, 'Where have you laid him?' And they said to him, 'Lord, come and see.' Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, 'See how he loved him?' And some of them said, 'How could this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?' Then Jesus, again groaning in his spirit, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' And Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, 'Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days.'" I love, if you read the King James, I love how the King James says, it says that verse, like there's a stench, he's been in there 4 days. It just says this, "But Lord, he stinketh." Anyway, that's true. That is what it says. You can check it out later. "Lord, he stinketh." That's good stuff. Anyway, it says, "And Jesus said to her, 'Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?' Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was laying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I say this, that they may believe that you sent me.' Now, when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come forth.' And he who had been dead came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, 'Loose him and let him go.'" If you pause there and give me your attention, here's the last thing I want to share with you, is that trials are where we become compassionate. It's so powerful to see the people weeping and then Jesus weeping with them. And by the way, Jesus knows the whole time what he's going to do. Even before he gets there, that's why he waits 2 extra days to finally go to Bethany to see them. He knows the whole time. That's why he waits for Lazarus to have been dead for 4 days until showing up. It's his plan, so he's not weeping over the loss. He's weeping because our sorrow moves the heart of God, that he isn't separated from our pain. He's with us in our pain. And the beautiful part is that your experience and the trial or difficulty that you have make you the perfect instrument in God's hand to help someone else who's going through their difficulty. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who had been through so much, says these words in 2 Corinthians 1, "All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us." You see, something happens in us when we experience a hurt. It changes us. We feel compassion for the person that's gone through a similar experience, because there's nothing like talking to someone who's been through the fire the way you've been through the fire and come out on the other side and live to tell the tale. Because that's what suffering does. It allows us to be comforted because we've experienced comfort by God. So some of you know the story, and many of you probably don't, but it was almost 10 years ago now that my daughter Mia, she was about 3, we took her to the doctor because her hands and feet were swelling up, and she got diagnosed with something called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is an illness, has about a 5% survival rate, and it just starts attacking all of the tissue, like right underneath your skin, and which is why you start swelling up and all of that. And so we took her to the pediatrician. They said it was Stevens-Johnson's. We took her to the ER, which they told us to go immediately to. They said it was Stevens-Johnson's. Then they took her by ambulance to Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital, and they told us that she had Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So they started running all kinds of tests, and then they came in to, after we had been there for a couple days, they told us, they said, "Listen, there's nothing we can do. The best thing that we can do is keep her comfortable. And so they just kind of gave her something for the pain as she continued to swell up. And I remember after they told us that, she told me that she had to go to the bathroom. And so she's in the hospital bed, and I pick her up, and I'm carrying her to the bathroom, and she looks at herself in the mirror. And I mean, her hands are so swollen. I mean, she couldn't even hold a crayon. Her feet are so swollen, she can't even walk. And her face is so swollen that she's almost unrecognizable. And she says, Dad, why do I look so different? And I didn't know what to say. Mama, I don't know. We're gonna pray that everything works out. And I brought her back to bed. And that night, Carrie climbed in the bed with her, and they slept. The two of them were asleep. And I'm sitting in this chair at Joe DiMaggio, and I was just, I just called out to God. I was so angry. And I was telling God, I mean, if I can just be totally honest with you, I was saying, I'm like, don't you realize everything I've done for you? I mean, and I just started reading the back of my baseball card of like all the things I've done and all the sacrifices that I've made. And I'm like, God, I'm like trying to follow you. I'm like trying to walk with you. I'm trying to lead other people to know you. And I mean, how could you do this to me? And so, listen, I can't say this has happened to me many times in my life, and I don't know that the words were audible. I don't think they were, but I think God said something to me that was so heavy. I mean, it was like a weight on my chest. And sometimes, you know, when you talk to God, there are going to be moments when he talks back. And I am just crying and crying and crying. Like, I don't know how can this happen. And God just spoke to me and said, Bob, I know what it's like to watch your child suffer. Because I watched my son suffer when he died on a cross. And in that moment, I knew the challenge that was before me. I had to decide whether I was going to follow Jesus for all of the stuff that he gave me, all the blessings that come from knowing God and walking with him, or I was going to follow him because he saved me, because he forgave me, because I owe him everything. And in that moment, I mean, it was and I had, so I prayed this prayer. And I said, God, if you decide to take her, I will be absolutely heartbroken. But I will count it as the best 3.5 years of my life to have been called me as dad. But no matter what, I'm still going to follow you. And the next morning, I mean, they told us that like a miracle, if Mia lived through this, would be for her to be able to like walk down a hall and back. I mean, they didn't think she'd be able to do anything. And by that next morning, I mean, she was noticeably better. By the end of that day, I mean, she was walking down to the playground, the play area on the floor, and then she was coming back. And then they told us, I mean, they wouldn't let her really eat anything because she had no appetite anyway. And then they said, but if she had an appetite, that was a big thing. And then I remember it was kind of like the beginning of the next day, and she said, Dad, I'm hungry. And we could see the swelling start to go down in her hand, and they're like, you know, if she's hungry, you can't give her really much, and you know, maybe something soft, you know, like a yogurt or ice cream, and I'm like, what do you want to eat? And she said, what I would love is I'd love like a vanilla milkshake. And so at Joe DiMaggio's, when I don't know if it's still there, but when we were there, they had a McDonald's in the lobby. And so I go down to the McDonald's to get her the milkshake. And by the way, like, who puts a McDonald's in a children's hospital? I just think like they're trying to create repeat business. So anyway, so I buy her the milkshake, and I run up the stairs to bring it to her. 2 days later, they let her go home. And in a couple of months, she's turning 13. And And we're so grateful. We're so grateful for what God did. But I mean, I'm telling you, there was a decision to be made in the middle of my pain. And if you were to ask me, Pastor Bob, when was it in college that you grew the most, or was it, in this? And I will tell you, that day in January in Joe DiMaggio's Children's Hospital, that was the moment that propelled my faith more than any other moment in my life. And this is why, whenever we come to the communion table, it should be a reminder that God is not separate from our suffering. He is all too familiar, because Jesus suffered for us. And that suffering produced forgiveness and new life, and it produced this incredible mercy that we enjoy, the grace that we receive, and the hope that we now have. And so if you're hurting today in the trial that you're in, can I just tell you that Jesus is hurting with you? And if you're mourning over loss today, can I tell you that Jesus is weeping with you? But the worst thing that could happen is that you go through this pain and it be in vain. So if you're disappointed with God today, listen, I understand. But there is something much worse than being disappointed with God. And that is being disappointed without God. So instead, realize that He is with you in this season, that He's never going to leave you, He's never going to forsake you, that if you're weeping, He's weeping with you. And He's standing by your side because He wants to see your faith soar like never before when you come out the other side of it. And we realize that's true because He has not asked us to do anything that He has not done Himself. That's why whenever we hold those communion elements in our hands, we know that not only does He call us to something greater through the trials and the difficulties, but that He went through suffering Himself so that we could find ourselves here. So I'm going to invite the ushers to come forward, and they're going to pass out the communion elements, and I'm going to just challenge you to hold on to them. We're going to partake of the elements together. But maybe this moment or two is an opportunity to just call out to God, to reconnect with Him, because He wants to do a great work in our moment together as we go through this. George, lead us, please.
Thanks for watching this week's message. Make sure to click the subscribe button below to stay up to date with all the things happening here at Calvary. God bless you.